G'day guys, welcome back to Tuner Racing. Today's the day the Tough Flux finally gets some boost. Gonna walk through the actual turbo install. Don't forget, if you like what you see, like, subscribe. If you want to support the channel, we do have merch available on our website, tunaracing.au. Most 3RZ parts are slowly being uploaded on there. If there's something that you're chasing that isn't on there, send us a message and we'll endeavour to help you out. So if you watch Mild to Wild episode 1, you'll know that I purchased this car secondhand. Don't know anything about it, just been driving it. It's a bit of a junk car, misfires, carries on, but dynoed up at 110 odd horsepower. Check out episode 1 here if you want to see that. Returning about 10 litres per 100 Ks. So this thing's got 300 odd thousand Ks on it. Had oil leaks. Like I said, it's got a misfire. So before I turbo it, I am going to do a compression check. I suspect it's just plugs. I don't think this thing's been very well maintained. I have already done the sump drain. That's in another video, so check that out here. And I have already done the fuel system. Again, another video. Check that out here. So first up, going to do a compression test, which will involve pulling off the air box, pong box, crossover tube here. Obviously, plugs out. I'll pull the EFI relay out, and we'll do a compression test. These things, we're mainly looking for consistency. We've got 4 that are all within sort of 5 to 10 pound max. I'll be happy with that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is take the throttle cable off and then the crossover. So 14mm spanner, loosen off your adjuster, full throttle and slide the throttle out, unclip it, lay it down the side. While we're at it, I'll just unplug airflow meter. CO2 meter. Click those wiring up out of the way, unclick the air filter. Now, depending on whether your car has been put back together properly, 2 12mm headed bolts into the side of the head under the pong box. This car does still have them, surprisingly. A lot of cars don't. So we'll just disconnect that, grab a pair of pliers. Okay, so because I've got those 12mm under the pong box, I'm going to split the air tube here. Well-serviced vehicle. We will still need the airflow meter, so we're not ditching that just yet. Undo the clamp there, grab my 12mm. Okay, now that I've got that undone, I'll try to remove the pong box. That to the side. Plug leads out. It's a good sign there's no oil on them. So 5/8 spark plug socket. So I'm going to say that was definitely my misfire. And that the plug gap on number 1 is about 3mm. I'm just pulling the EFI relay so that the injectors and coils don't go. It'll be marked on the top of your relay box, but it is, as if your car is the same model as this, bottom right. And screw my compression tester in. So this car is cold. It's only been driven 20 metres to get it into the shed here. that on. Out of gear. So I tend to go 5 or 6 rotations, or when the needle stops. Obviously got to put plugs back in it, so I'm going to put new plugs in it. NGKs are my plug of choice. Factory plugs, BKR 5EYEA or something. Go up a couple of heat range or colder plug. BKR 7E is what I generally use, right up to 700-800 horsepower. That plug will do fine. We do need to gap them down though. For something like this, I'll go to 20 thou or half mil. Okay, so the gap is obviously the distance between the strap and the electrode. So use a feeler gauge to measure that gap, and we're going to squish that down. All right, so that's our 4 plugs gapped. Bone of contention, I always like to put a little bit of never seize on the plugs. I have had to deal with seized in plugs before and it's not nice, so just only on the threads, obviously, a little bit on the threads, and then we'll put them back in. Put the plug back in. I'm going to use my socket to do it so that I don't close that gap up anymore. And plug leads back on. So these actually run a wasted spark, which means that 2 spark plugs actually fire at the same time. So they're marked on the end of the coil here. So you've got 2 and 3 and 1 and 4. So you can use that to make sure you put your plug leads back in the right spot. Use these coils right up to 550 horsepower without any issue. Same coil as a 1FZ. So if you're chasing spares, 1FZ's got 3 of them on them. But that's basically our compression test done and spark plugs in, and we can rip the exhaust off and start fitting our manifold up. All right, so now it's time to rip the exhaust off. So we've got to get that heat shield off. So 4 12 mils. You might need a ratchet spanner to get down next to the other heat shield against the brake lines. It's in there a bit tight. And one in a bit of an awkward spot up underneath. The next step we'll do from underneath. I'm lucky enough to have a hoist. You can do it on the ground though. So we'll get underneath and we'll get the exhaust disconnected. So from underneath, you can see my oil leaks, which I'll sort out while I've got the turbo off, but you guys won't have to do that. It's the oil filter housing onto the side of the block. Alright, so to get the exhaust off, we need to undo the 3 bolts on the flange up there. They're going to be a 14 mil head. Good chance they're going to snap. We'll give it a crack. We need to take this bracket here off. So we've got, what is that, a 12 mil here, and that bracket will slide down, and then we've got the 2 bell housing bolts, 17 mils here. One is a genuine bell housing bolt that goes through to the block. One is not. So we obviously have to put the one that goes through back in. So we'll take that off. We're going to end up having to cut this exhaust to tee back into it. Ideally, you would put a full 3-inch system on straight up, but if you are trying to do this on a budget and stick to the bare minimum, then we reuse our original exhaust. That's what I'm going to do in this version, just to see how much difference it actually makes. So I'll get me 12 mil, 17 and 14, and I'll get that out. All right, so now I'm going to cut the exhaust through here. You use an air hacksaw for this. Use an angle grinder if you're very, very careful. You don't want to touch any of the chassis or brake lines, torsion bar, etc. I only use this because it's probably the least likely to cause me any issue. So we're done under here for now. We're going to get the manifold off. We've got 6 14 mil headed nuts on the manifold. Most factory turbo engines will have 2 bolts per port. Obviously these are NA, they only have the 1 per pair on the bottom. So 4 bolts on the top, or 4 studs on the top, 2 studs on the bottom. It does mean these are prone to blowing that gasket if you get too much back pressure. So you want to make sure that your manifold's nice and flat, and you use a new gasket and do everything you can to stop that from leaking. With a log manifold, you can get them on and off and reuse those studs. With a spaghetti style manifold, with this steering column, often you'll have to change the studs out to a shorter stud or possibly a bolt. They're an M10 1.25 thread. Okay, so you can see on my engine there's a bit of oil here. That's actually not an oil gallery. That doesn't go anywhere. That will be basically oil that's got in there, seeped down from either a leaking rocker cover, from when it's been filled up, got in behind there and it can't get out. I've seen that a fair few times. There's a little bit on that one too. It's not a cracked head. It's not anything like that. The main thing you're going to be looking for is your black marks to show a leak from previously. Make sure that this is all nice and flat and doesn't have any scorches out of it. So you can see this is the oil filter housing here. It's got an oil cooler built into it. Between the housing and the oil filter. So basically you've got water out and water in. So this is where I'm going to take my water from. We are going to get our oil feed out of this as well. I'll show you when it's off, but you've got a 24, I think it is, or M18 anyway, M18 by 1.5 thread here and also in here. This one here is actually pre-oil filter. So if you do decide to use that one, I'd recommend putting a filter in the line. This one here that is down in there is post-filter. So I like to try and use that one if possible. Here is a water port. That normally has a bleeder in it, or in some models will have a bleeder that sticks way out here, which makes it very, very difficult to access this. In that case, I pull it out and replace it with a bung, because the early ones had a bung anyway, and I've never used that to bleed air out of the system because it's such a pain to get to. So we'll get a container, we'll drain the water out of it, and we'll keep going. So I am going to remove the whole oil filter housing here because I have an oil leak from it. You don't need to remove it. You only need to pull this water hose off, because we're going to use out and in and put the turbo in series with it. A lot of people will go T's and put the turbo in parallel. I've never had an issue doing it this way. It keeps everything nice and compact and out of the way. So I'm going to use this one and do a nice loop up and to the outside of the turbo, and I'm going to use this one here to come up to the inside of the turbo. So this O-ring here, in the shape of a snowman, is the culprit of my oil leak. So I'm going to replace that now. But as I said, you don't need to take this off. You can just undo this oil gallery here and fit the fittings in to get your oil supply. Okay, so I've refitted my oil filter housing back to where you would do it if you didn't have to remove it to fix an oil leak. So basically this pipe, this pipe here has been removed. This is all back on. Like I said, this is where you would get to if you were not having to remove it to fix an oil leak. So now we just need to undo this here and put our oil feed fittings in. And while the manifold's off, I find it a lot easier to get these hoses on now. So we'll do that. 22mm in on this one here. They're not normally overly tight. You will struggle to get a ring spanner on there unless you've got a very narrow ring spanner. I've already cracked this one, so does have a sealing washer, aluminium washer on it, 18 by 1.5 thread. I'll get what we need for that. So here's my oil feed adapter. I'm going to chuck that in now. So I've made my oil line massively too long because I don't know exactly how I'm going to run it just yet. So I'm going to nip it up there like that. So that's where it can run. As I said, it is easier. Well, I feel it's easier to put these hoses on now. So I'm going to do that too. So one of the reasons that I put these on now is because this is actually 1/2-inch hose. They measure up at 14 mil. You can't buy fittings that go onto your turbo to suit a 14 mil hose. So you've got to get a bit of grip strength about you and put these hoses on. I put the hose clamps on the hose already so I don't forget later. It isn't overly difficult to put these on now while you can get to it. So you can see how that one's going to run. It's going to go up like that, and then this one is going to come down the other side. You can see I got them on relatively easily. If you did get the verniers out, like I said, 14 mil, and this is 1/2-inch hose, but you can certainly get it on there. I've just used one continuous piece of hose that I'll cut once I've got my manifold on. But I'm going to do these clamps up now. Try to put them in a position that you could possibly get to once the manifold's back on, because you don't want to be trying to undo these later and be cursing the position that they're in. Alright, so that's our water lines and our oil feed done. You can see down there the little blue cap is my oil return that I've capped off on the sump from when I did the sump. So all our lines are going to run down this one side, so it's nice and neat. I've got my new gasket here. So one thing to be cautious of with the manifold flanges and gaskets is they actually only go one way. So you'll see that doesn't want to fit that way. Whereas it goes straight on this way. So these two bottom studs, one stud's lower than the other. I've seen numerous people weld up manifolds and actually put the flange the wrong way around and then have to elongate that hole to get it to fit. So just make sure you do that. I always use a little bit of ultra copper around the holes. Like I said, just anything to try and stop these from leaking, because they do only have the one stud between two ports on the bottom. So I'm going to do that now. Alright, so here we go. Just got a light smear just around the holes, both sides. Need to be overly heavy on that. And of course, one of two ways it'll go, and I'll always pick the wrong way. So I'm going to sit that on there. Alright. So here is my log manifold. I'm going to sit on like so. Alright, so now we've got to do up manifold bolts. I always like to start with the bottom ones because there's only two. So I will nip that one. Nip that one. Right. That's our manifold on. So while we can access it, I'm going to put the wastegate in. Make sure that you have the right spring in it. These come with 7 and 14. Some will have two 7s to get the 14. Some will have a 14-pound outer. If you're running a factory ECU setup, I would recommend starting with a 5 in case you get any boost creep, depending on your exhaust setup. Just gives you a bit of a safety margin. You can always change it later. 7 PSI is generally the max that I'd recommend on a factory ECU, unless you've got some other added fuel source, like water meth or something like that. So yeah, start lower and build up rather than start high and go bang. So we'll get this on. Make sure the seat is in the bottom of the wastegate. So the seat needs to be in before you put it on. So you haven't done one of these before, as you do it up, it will compress the piston onto that seat. So we only want to nip it up at this stage so that we can get our positioning. So just tight enough that it can't come off, but you can still twist it so that we can get our positioning later. So I'll go a little bit tighter so there's no rock in it. So make sure all your bungs are in and your barbs are in. So you've got vacuum/boost source on top and bottom in 2 sides, and then you've also got water in these Gen 5 Turbosmart wastegates. So I generally block them off if you're not going to use them, just so you can't get anything in it. Obviously, you need to block off the opposite side boost source so that it actually works. Don't block off both tops if you're only using the bottom as your single boost reference, because obviously you create a vacuum and it won't work. So make sure you've got the barb in the top, barb in the bottom, and then the rest are all bunged off and they're barbed into the boost source, not into the water. I generally don't water cool these. Never had an issue. There's obviously a reason they did it. So if you feel like running extra water lines, go for it, but I've never needed to. Okay, so with this turbo positioning, the top radiator hose is going to sit very, very close to the turbo. So I just want to reposition it slightly so you can see that it kicks back, and obviously our turbo is going to sit right there. So we basically want to shorten this to pull that in, which will in turn straighten that up, and we're going to shorten that to pull the whole thing that way. So we'll take her off and cut it and put it back on. So I've just cut about 25mm off each end and put it back on. So now's as good a time as any to pull the airbox out. We're not going to be using it. So we're trying to avoid it kinking. We don't want that to kink. It's not too bad. But you can see how much further forward this now sits, which was what we were hoping for. All right, so I've put the studs in, sat the gasket on. I've put the oil drain onto the turbo because it's easier to do on the bench. Loosened off the compressor and the turbine housing, so 6 13mm bolts on each of those. Just crack them off so that you can turn the housings to get your positioning correct. Now I'm going to sit it on, finger tight it, make sure I'm happy with everything, and then tighten her up. The turbo's bolted on, lines are roughed in. I've tightened up these 6 13mm headed bolts to give me my drain at 6 o'clock and my feed at 12 o'clock. Haven't tightened the front up yet, but leave that for now until we get to doing the intercooler pipe, or in this case, crossover pipe. Now I'm gonna put the fittings into the side of the turbo and cut the water hoses and then the oil feed hose, which will probably sit something like that. Okay, so all your Garrett and Garrett copy turbos, M14, 1.5 water outlet. So these turbos come with a -6, and I think most do for your water. But because we're using the push lock off the factory fittings, we're going to go to -8. As nice as it would be to use alley spanners for this, you just can't get them in there. So only use a socket. Both of those. So I want to give that plenty of room for that drain. I'm going to go just there. Now these are a push lock fitting, so they don't need a hose clamp. Once they're on, good luck ever getting them off. You pretty much got to cut them off. Because they are quite difficult to get on, I like to put a little bit of lube on. It'll never come off. Generally speaking with these, once you start getting it on there, if you stop, it won't keep going. Make sure that we've got clearance on our steering column. So on the inside, I'm going to do it a little bit differently. Put an extension on. And then our 90 is going to go onto the extension. Which will put our hose something like that. So I've already put my 45 degree on the end of my -10 hose. I'm going to do a length check off the bottom of the drain on the turbo, just there, and put my 90 onto my drain here, take my cap off, cut it, make my hose, and that'll be my drain done. All right, so I'm going to call it for tonight. I'll come back and do the rest tomorrow. But that's the oil feed on and done, water feed and return done, and the drain down there done. So basically just got the crossover pipe, which will need a barb for the idle air controller, a exhaust and either plumback or screamer, depending on how motivated I get. And then we'll need a 180-degree bend here to remount the airflow meter. And that'll be her pretty much turboed, and we'll test it and see how it works. Okay, so dump pipe can go in from the top. I didn't show much of the fab work making this because with any luck you've bought one of our kits and you won't need to make it. So you can see here the tab that I've put on the exhaust. It's why I haven't done that top V-band up, so that I can move this to get it where I need it to be. So I just need my other hand to do that, so I'll put the camera down. Okay, so now we've got to put the wastegate pipe on, which is going to be very difficult to show, but I've sat the clamp over the output of the wastegate already. So see how we go here. Through this hole here. And attempt So the next step is to do up all the V-bands, so back of the turbo. Okay, so our next step will be to put on our, or start to put on our crossover tube. So throw the hose clamps onto the silicone and then push the silicone on. There's a stopper just here. For that. Fingers aren't quite strong enough. Put our idle air control bypass tube on. Get everything sort of sitting where we want it. I'm just going to put the writing down as much as I can. There we go. Okay, so our next step will be to cut our 90. So our 90 is going to sit off our turbo onto our crossover. So we need to cut both sides. Go there. Better to go less than more. Always cut it again. And there. So I find the easiest way to do this is to grab a hose clamp, put it on, nip it down till it's firm, and then run your Stanley blade around your hose clamp. Now, it'll be a bit awkward to get this second pipe on. Obviously we're over quite a short distance. Alright, and that is our crossover. Right, now that they're all on, we can do up our turbo compressor housing again. Got it where it's going to stay. So 13mm spanner, 6 bolts into the back of the turbine housing. All right, so next step is going to be to get the airflow meter off of the original airbox lid. Unfortunately, we need to run quite a bit of pipe length between the front of the turbo and the airflow meter to stop stalling and things like that when you back off, and air actually will come backwards through the airflow meter and car will stall. So we run two 90 degrees or 180 degree bend there. In this case, it's a 90 silicon and a 90 alley before the airflow meter, just to try and reduce that from happening. This factory ECU that doesn't know you've put a turbo on it, it can still happen, but this reduces it. Because of that, we can't run the factory airbox. So if you want to run the factory airbox, pretty much have to go to an aftermarket ECU, or put up with stalling when you back off. So basically what we're going to do is just run a hacksaw blade straight along this edge here, so that we can get this airflow meter. We're going to use a 3-inch silicon joiner onto our alley pipe, and we're going to put our pod filter straight onto the end of this, which will sit up next to the brake master. The other benefit of that is that the factory wiring will reach where we need it to. This is again only if you're doing a factory ECU setup. If you're doing an aftermarket ECU, you could basically run a 45 and put the pod over here. You could run pipe work up to the factory airbox if it's a 4B and you're running a snorkel. Just beware with the 4Bs though. I have had this before where the inlet into the airbox is actually a restriction. So put it on the dyno and you're struggling, you may find that that's part of your problem. So as I said, we're just going to get a hacksaw and run straight through there. If you look up the end of that, you'll see there's a gauze in there. We actually aren't going to use the gauze. I've cut the airflow meter off the airbox. As you can see, no gauze there. I forgot to order a pod, so this is the one that I had laying around. The only other ones I've got are all 4-inch. The 3-inch pod will fit with a little bit of love. Make sure you put it on the right way. I have seen people actually put the airflow meter in back to front after they've cut it, and they can't work out why their car won't run. That'll be why. So our next step is going to be make a very slight trim on our air filter inlet silicon. Just because the coils are where they are, this will fit as is, but we just want it to be a little bit more than 90. So I'm actually going to trim this silicon off on a slight angle. So same process as before with the hose clamp. Difference being, of course, that now the hose clamp's on an angle. It just makes the silicon clear that coil by a little bit more rather than rub on the plug. I just feel like it's a bit nicer. So next step is just the breather. No real need for clamps. So the next thing I'm going to do is get a vac source for the fuel pressure regulator and the wastegate. So you could tee off of an existing line, but there is a bung here in the front on this one, and on a lot of them, this one not included, they have one on the back here as well. So So here's my back line that I fished out from down the back, coming from my wastegate. I'm going to run it through the manifold with the wiring harness. Pick a nice route and run under the wiring harness, I think. So I've run from my back source through a T, one going to the fuel reg and the other going to the wastegate. Once we go to an aftermarket ECU, that'll get changed because I'll run a MAC valve, which will interrupt that back source or boost source to the wastegate, and I won't want to share that with my fuel pressure regulator anymore, and also I'll need a map sensor, so that will change. So when I do go to drive this, I will want to monitor the AFRs. So I've got a standalone O2 sensor, plugs into the cigarette lighter, which I'll run up and into the driver's door when I go for a drive. I highly recommend that it's tested, at least on initial install, to try and get your fuel pressure set. The only adjustment you can make on a factory ECU is fuel pressure. So definitely want to monitor it. Okay, so when I drive this, I am going to want to monitor boost, just to make sure everything's doing what it's supposed to do. I'm not going to mount a boost gauge permanently. So I don't really like gauges too much. I prefer a dash setup. So what I'm going to do is just find a boost source. There's one, and I'm just going to tee into it with my boost gauge. Okay, so everything's plugged in, everything's filled up, everything's pretty much ready to start this. Before I do that, I'm going to make sure that the turbo gets oil. So to do that, you take the fitting out, put a little bit of oil in the top, spin the shaft, make sure oil's going through, and then also what I like to do is take the fitting off, put it into a bottle, and crank the motor over until we get oil there to make sure that we've definitely got an oil feed. So I'm going to take that EFI relay out again that I took out to do the compression test, which is just this one here. That'll stop the car from starting. My oil feed, put it into a bottle. Okay, so it took a little while. I do have thick oil in this, being an old motor, and all those lines are new. Now I'm going to put my EFI relay back in. We'll do first start. Don't worry, I do have new battery terminals for it. They're on the list. They're going to get done today. Ready for first start now. I've got oil in our turbo. I've got my wideband and my boost gauge hooked up, but we don't need them until we're driving it. So for the moment, we just want to make sure that it starts, runs, and doesn't leak. So in a previous video, I showed how to install the rising rate fuel regulator. In that video, obviously, it wasn't turboed yet, so the vac line was hooked up to the original Pong box. Now that it is turboed, that vac line or boost line needs to go to manifold pressure. So it's teed off the same line that's going to my wastegate. Then we need to set our fuel pressure. So factory with no vac is like 38 pound. I tend to run about 10 pound more than that when we put the turbo on, and most of them have been all right. But we'll see how we go. I've got the wideband on there, so we'll check and see what that is. To adjust the fuel pressure though, basically crack the nut, Allen key, wind it down. Clockwise is more pressure, anti-clockwise is less pressure. I tend to set it with the vac line disconnected, but with the car running, and just block the vac line off. That's pretty much it. So let's empty out the tray of all the parts that we didn't put back in and go for a drop. Not bad. Out of a standard exhaust, so I went against my own words and I put a 7-pound spring in this one because I didn't have a 5 on hand. But it's holding 7-pounder boost, and I'm seeing 10-to-1 AFRs under power, 14.7 cruise, and obviously the diesel fuel cut, so it's up in the 20s on diesel. Doesn't sound bad.
How's that, mate?
I think I'm going to have to build an exhaust. Just proves it, doesn't it?
It does. The thing is very, very hot.
There you go. If you're going to do it, don't use the standard